Hi, my name is Hunter Linker, and this is my video presentation for my action research. So, my title is Collaborative Learning Effects on Motivation and Achievement in a Middle School Math Class. First, let's talk about my problem of practice. My topic was collaborative learning activities, achievement, and motivation. Now, what do I mean by collaborative learning activities? In general, collaborative learning has many forms. The specific type of collaborative learning that occurred in my classroom for this study were group projects done in class within a single class period. For each activity, my students worked in groups of 3. I kept the groupings the same throughout the entire action research. Now, what is meant by achievement and motivation? Achievement is measured by how well students are performing or showing mastery over a given standard. I will talk more about what specific methods were used to measure that achievement on the next slide. In this study, motivation was measured by how engaged students were during the collaborative learning activities, how they perceive group projects in general, and how they felt directly after each collaborative learning activity. I will talk more about what specific methods were used to measure motivation on the next slide as well. So let's go over the plan of action for my action research. So here it is. My main research question is, how does collaborative learning affect student motivation and achievement when implemented in an 8th grade classroom? So the 3 main topics that I researched for my literature review were perception of collaborative learning activities, effects of collaborative learning activities on student motivation, and effects of collaborative learning activities on student achievement. The setting was an 8th grade middle school math class. There were 18 students in this class, ages 13 to 15. The only intervention that was performed was introducing my students to collaborative learning before I began my action research. Basically, I spoke with my students about how I was working on my master's degree and that I would be conducting research with their specific class. I explained to them what collaborative learning was and also why I was working on my master's degree. I asked their opinions on how they felt about working in groups and if they were excited, anxious, or neutral about the upcoming research that I was going to conduct with their class. Most of my students seemed to feel neutral about it. So for the data collected in the study, there was 3 different types: artifacts, observational, and inquiry. For artifacts, I collected 2 different data points. The first one was the collaborative learning activities. I graded each activity as a group. This means that students did not receive an individual score. For this portion of the research, I was more interested in seeing how students performed as a group, not as individuals. The second data point was the STAR math scores. I gave my students a STAR test at the beginning and at the end of the research. This was how I measured individual student growth. Now, for observational data, I kept a teacher journal. I mainly used this during the collaborative learning activities. I would walk around while students were working and while working on the assignment, and I would take notes. I was looking for things such as how engaged students were, how well they seemed to be communicating and working together, and to see if all students were participating. I also looked for any off-task behaviors, such as talking about things not related to the assignment, putting their head down, or actively not participating in the study or in the activity. I use this data to assist in measuring student motivation and engagement. I also looked to see if there were any correlations between students being motivated and engaged and their achievement levels. For inquiry data, I collected 3 data points. The first data point was a self and group evaluation form that each student completed directly after each collaborative learning activity. I used these forms to gauge students' perceptions about the group project that they had just finished. I wanted to see if student perception of group projects improved, stayed the same, or decreased after each activity. The second data point was the pre and post student survey. I gave students a survey at the beginning and at the end of the entire research period. This survey asked them generalized questions about how they felt about group work and if they felt group work motivated them to do well on an assignment or not. I used this survey to help see any changes in student perception about group work over time. Finally, the last data point in this category was informal conversations. I would periodically have short, informal conversations with my students to help keep a pulse on how they felt about the group projects, or on how they felt the group projects were going and if they were enjoying them or not. So the overall timeline for the action research was about 6 weeks. The first week consisted of the pre-survey and the pre-assessment for the STAR math test. The next 4 weeks or so consisted of the collaborative learning activities. And then during the last week, students took the post-survey and the post-assessment for the STAR math test. All right, so that is it for the plan of action. Next, we're going to talk about my findings. So this is a graph of the STAR math scores, the pre and the post. And this was how I measured individual student achievement. The STAR test included the same standards from the collaborative learning activities. Overall, 12 out of 18 students showed improvement. This was indicative of a positive correlation between collaborative learning activities and individual student achievement. Most students who showed growth only showed a small or a medium amount of growth. Only a few students showed a large amount of growth. For example, this student showed a large amount of growth, and maybe this student, and possibly this student. Most students increase only by a little bit, such as this one and this one. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving. Uh, so this tells me that while collaborative learning activities had a positive effect on individual student achievement, it did not have as significant of an effect as I would have liked. Next, we have the collaborative learning activity group scores. So these were how I measured my students' ability to work as a team. 5 out of the 6 groups showed a positive trend on their performance over time. This shows that collaborative learning activities had a positive effect on their ability to communicate and work together to solve a complex problem. Certain groups reported that they felt they were learning how to work better with their partners after each activity. Only one group did not show any improvement and actively did not work together on any of the activities. That was this group over here, group number 6. Groups 1 through 5 all showed steady improvement. And finally, we have the pre and the post survey scores. So these were how I gauged my students' overall perceptions about group projects. I gave them a pre-survey before we did any of the collaborative learning activities, and I gave them a post-survey the day after we finished our last activity. The change in my students' perceptions of group projects was positive for 15 out of 18 students. Only 3 students' perceptions of group projects either did not change or decreased after the action research was completed. These are the same 3 students that were in group number 6. Now we have the conclusion. So, upon completing my action research, I found that there was generally a positive effect on most students in the classroom. A majority of my students showed both individual growth and growth in a group setting. Additionally, almost all students' perceptions on group projects increased by the end of the action research. Through notes recorded in my teacher journal while students were working, I observed that most students' motivation seemed to be positively affected by working in a group. This was confirmed by the pre and post surveys as well. And these are also students that indicated higher levels of motivation when working in a group. Only a few students had a negative experience. Now let's talk about what sort of reflections I had after completing my action research. I've been a teacher for about 5 years now, and during these first 5 years of teaching, I have spent the majority of my focus trying to master a few key foundational teaching skills, such as high level questioning, circulating, checking for understanding, using data to inform my instruction, and building solid, positive relationships with my students. Many of my lessons follow the same format, and I tend not to deviate too much from my particular teaching style. This action research project that I did pushed me to try a new teaching method that I haven't really explored before. Now, after seeing the positive results of the study, I am motivated to continue exploring more teaching methods and adding them to my repertoire. So, for the next steps, continuing with what was mentioned on the previous slide, my next steps as a teacher are to incorporate more and more teaching methods. Now that I feel as though I have a solid foundation to build upon, I feel as though I'm ready to challenge myself and see what other teaching styles benefit my students. I'm finally at a place where I feel comfortable exploring as a teacher and seeing what works and what doesn't. My experience doing action research has taught me how to better take data so that I can truly measure how effective a new teaching style might be in my classroom. I'm excited to continue this journey of creativity and exploration in my classroom. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I really appreciate it. And that is it.